Chapter 3, Biological Foundations of Behavior. In this chapter, we are going to look at the nervous system, neurons, brain, endocrine system, damage, plasticity, repair of the brain, genetics and behavior, and then health and wellness. The nervous system is the body's electrochemical communication system, and neuroscience is the field of study of the nervous system. The researchers that conduct research on the nervous system are called neuroscientists. The nervous system is complex, integrated, and adaptable. The word used is plasticity, the ability to change itself and adapt to what is needed. And also, it uses electrochemical transmission. So nerves carry information from the body to the brain and from the brain to the body. As a person interacts with and adapts to the world around them, the brain and nervous system receive information and transmit incoming sensory information. They integrate this information and direct the body's motor activities. So we have afferent nerves or sensory nerves that carry information to the brain and spinal cord. These nerves communicate information about the external environment and internal conditions from the sensory receptors to the brain and the spinal cord. And the efferent nerves or motor nerves carry information out of the brain and spinal cord. These nerves facilitate communication from the brain and spinal cord to other areas of the body. So the central nervous system is comprised of the brain and the spinal cord. The function of the peripheral nervous system is to bring information to and from the brain and spinal cord. It also carries out the commands of the central nervous system. Now, part of the peripheral system is the somatic system. So the peripheral nervous system has the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system is to convey information from the skin and muscles to the central nervous system. It regulates information about pain and temperature. The autonomic nervous system's function is to take messages to internal organs, and so it regulates breathing, heart rate, and digestion. The autonomic nervous system is comprised of both the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system prepares a person for a stressful situation, and the parasympathetic nervous system calms the body down after that stressful situation. The sympathetic nervous system is associated with fight or flight, and the parasympathetic nervous system is thought of rest and digest. So the sympathetic revs you up, the parasympathetic calms you down. Glial cells, or glia, provide the support and nutrition in the nervous system. New research suggests that glial cells may play a more active role in memory, Alzheimer's disease, pain, and some psychological disorders as well. Neurons are the nerve cells that control the information processing system. You have about 1 billion in your brain alone. Mirror neurons are not structurally different from other motor neurons, but they're specialized cells that appear to respond to both sensory and motor. Mirror neurons become activated both when an individual performs a motor act, as well as when they just observe the same motor act done by someone else. So the role of these cells has sparked predictions about the function of neurons in imitating, social cognition, empathy, and understanding behavior. So let's look at the structure of a neuron. The cell body contains the nucleus, which manufactures what the neuron needs for growth and maintenance, as well as for neurotransmitters. The dendrites, they receive information and send that information into the cell body. The axon then carries information away from the cell body to other cells. The myelin sheath is this cover here that is on the axon. It is semi-permeable, meaning that only certain substances can pass into and out of the axon. It is responsible for the insulation of the axons as well as the speed of the transmission of the nerve impulse. Multiple sclerosis is a nerve disorder that occurs when there's a breakdown of this myelin sheath. In order for a neuron to send information to another one, the source neuron sends an electrical charge. Positive and negative ions are floating inside and outside of the axon. Positive ions are sodium and potassium. The negative ions are chlorine. Inside the membrane of the axon are gated channels known as ion channels. And these ion channels can open and close, allowing the positive and negative ion out of the axon. So it's like a little chain reaction of opening all of these gates as that chemical reaction is sent down the ion. When the neuron is at rest and not transmitting information, the ion channels are closed, and there's a negative charge inside of the axon. When a neuron is inactive, it's said to be at a resting potential, and the voltage is somewhere between -60 and -75 millivolts. So when a neuron becomes activated by an incoming impulse, the channels at the base of the axon open briefly, allowing positively charged ions to flow into the neuron. So they would open and allow them to come in. This action depolarizes the membrane by decreasing the charge difference inside and outside the neuron. The potassium channels then open and the positive ions move back out and return the axon to a negative state. The same process occurs as the next group of channels open briefly. An action potential is the term given when the electrical impulses flow down the axon. This all or nothing principle refers to the process by which an electrical impulse reaches a certain level of intensity known as a threshold. It fires and moves all the way down the axon without losing its intensity and can be compared to a firecracker. Once the fuse is lit, the spark will travel to the end with the same intensity at which it started. So you can see here how as it starts, the channels are going to open up, and the ion exchange is going to start taking place, and that will move down the length of the axon with the different gates opening and closing as this is occurring. The amount of charge has to hit the threshold in order to kick off the action potential. Neurons communicate with one another through chemicals that carry messages across the space between them. So if this is one, you don't see the cell body over here, but this is one neuron, and this was another one starting here, you can see that they're not connected. There is a gap between them. And that junction is called a synapse. It's the space between one neuron and the dendrites of another neuron, called the synaptic gap. At the end of the axon, there are fibers that end in what are called terminal buttons. You see these little nodes here, and this is a picture of a big one. And neurotransmitters carry the electrical information across the synaptic gaps. After the neurotransmitter crosses the synaptic gap, it gets picked up by a receiving neuron. Most neurons pick up and secrete only one type of neurotransmitter. Neurotransmitters are like puzzle pieces. They fit into a specific receptor site in order to continue sending the message. So if it doesn't fit, it doesn't get to activate the action. After the neurotransmitter has delivered its message, some of the chemical is used up in the production of energy, and some of it can be reabsorbed by the sending neuron in a process known as reuptake. So if this is the sending neuron here and it releases the chemicals into the space, and not all of them are absorbed or used for energy, it take the chemical. There are a variety of neurotransmitters with each playing a different role and function. Some of them will excite the neuron to fire, others will inhibit the neuron from firing, and some neurotransmitters do both excitatory and inhibitory actions. Scientists are not sure exactly how many neurotransmitters exist. Here are a few we do know about. Acetylcholine, or ACH, sets the firing of neurons into motion and is involved in muscle action, learning, and memory. It's found throughout the central and the peripheral nervous systems. The venom from the bite of a black widow spider causes ACH to gush out of the synapses between the spinal cord and the skeletal muscles, producing violent muscle spasms and weakness. Similar to this, since muscles are activated by the acetylcholine, an injection of Botox destroys the acetylcholine, paralyzes the muscle, which then keeps it from contracting, and then this keeps the skin from wrinkling from where it has been pushed together. A deficiency in acetylcholine has been found in people diagnosed with the degenerative brain disorder Alzheimer's, which gradually destroys memory. Another neurotransmitter is GABA, which is gamma-aminobutyric acid. It is found throughout the central nervous system, and it keeps many neurons from firing. It's almost like the body's brake pedal. Low levels of GABA are involved in anxiety. Valium and other anti-anxiety drugs increase the inhibiting effects of GABA. Now, glutamate is the most prevalent neurotransmitter. It has a role in exciting neurons to fire and is particularly involved in learning and memory. It is kind of like the accelerator, whereas GABA was the brake pedal. It can stimulate the brain and trigger headaches and seizures. Recently, researchers have proposed glutamate as a factor in anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, Alzheimer's, and Parkinson's. Norepinephrine, also called noradrenaline, inhibits neuron firing in the central nervous system, but it excites the heart muscles, intestines, and urogenital tract. Stress releases norepinephrine. It also helps control agitation, while too little is associated with depression. Amphetamines and cocaine cause hyperactive manic states of behavior by rapidly increasing the norepinephrine levels in the brain. Neurotransmitters can work in teams of two or more. So, for example, norepinephrine works with acetylcholine to regulate stages of sleep and wakefulness. Dopamine is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, and it helps control voluntary movements. Dopamine can also affect sleep, mood, attention, and learning. Stimulant drugs can influence dopamine receptors. Cocaine and amphetamines produce excitement, alertness, elevated mood, decreased fatigue, and sometimes motor activity by activating the dopamine receptors. Dopamine is also related to the personality trait of extroversion and the psychological disorder known as schizophrenia. Low levels of dopamine have been found associated with Parkinson's disease, a degenerative neurological disorder in which a person develops jerky physical movements and a tremor and has difficulty with speech and walking. It affects about 1 million people in the United States. Serotonin is involved in sleep regulation, mood, attention, and learning as well. Low levels of serotonin are associated with depression. Antidepressant medications often slow down the reuptake of serotonin into the terminal buttons and thereby increasing the level of serotonin within the neuron. There are 15 types of serotonin receptors in the brain. Each type of antidepressant has a specific effect on those different receptors. There are critics about the role of serotonin in depression. So if you want to read up more on it, you can look up studies. Endorphins are natural opiates. Greeks used wild poppies to induce euphoria as back as 4th century BC. Endorphins stimulate neuron firing. They depress the central nervous system activity and alleviate pain and elevate the feelings of pleasure. Researchers found that opium plugs in the sophisticated system of natural opiates that naturally lie within the deep recesses of our brain. Morphine mimics this action of endorphins by stimulating receptors in the brain involved with pleasure and pain. Oxytocin. It's a hormone that plays an important role in the experience of love and social bonding. Recent studies have found high levels of oxytocin were found in new lovers, and that these levels were still elevated about 6 months later compared to people who were not dating. Research has linked oxytocin to the way in which some individuals respond to stress, especially women, and may help explain why, when stressed, women seek out relationships and bonds. It's also released when women give birth and is responsible for that love at first sight type bond between mother and baby. Drugs can have a variety of effects on the functioning of neurotransmitters. Some drugs interfere with the work of a neurotransmitter while others mimic or increase the effect of it. If you're interested in finding out more about the effects of drugs in the brain, search for Mouse Party. It's part of a genetic program at Utah on addiction, and it's something that can help you study about the different types of drugs and their effects on the brain. Neural networks are interconnected pathways of nerve cells that integrate sensory input and motor output. Some neurons have short axons and communicate with others nearby, while other neurons have longer axons and communicate with circuits of neurons farther away. Neural networks can be altered through changes in synaptic connections. In terms of memory, the strength of connected neurons determines how well a person remembers information. The network of neurons are not visible to the human eye. However, technology has helped neuroscientists form pictures and structures of the neurons and the brain. Much of the brain imaging available today came from studies on patients with brain damage from injury or disease. Brain lesions refer to an abnormal disruption in the tissue of the brain resulting from injury or disease. Neuroscientists also make lesions in the brains of animals to see the effects on the animal's behavior. Brain lesions can be made by removing brain tissue, destroying tissue with the laser, or eliminating tissue by injection with the drug. Electrical recording. The electroencephalograph, or EEG, records the electrical activity in the brain. When electrodes are placed on a person's scalp, they detect brain wave activity, and this is recording on a chart as an electroencephalogram. The EEG is used to assess brain damage, seizure disorder, and other problems. A study using EEG activity suggests that positive emotion-provoking experiences tend to activate the left prefrontal area, while fear-provoking experiences tend to activate the right prefrontal area, suggesting that brain activity in the left prefrontal area was related to higher measures of well-being, self-acceptance, positive relations with others, purpose in life, and life satisfaction. Single unit recording is used when a probe is inserted in or near an individual neuron. The probe transmits the electrical activity to an amplifier so researchers can see the activity. A computerized axial tomography, or CAT scan, also called CT scan, produces a three-dimensional image that is obtained through X-rays of the head. A positron emission tomography, or PET scan, measures the amount of glucose in various areas of the brain, and then it sends this information to a computer where it's analyzed. Neurons use glucose for energy, so glucose levels vary with the levels of activity in the brain. A magnetic resonance image, MRI, creates a magnetic field around a person's body and uses a radio wave to construct images of the person's tissue and biochemical activities. Since there are no known side effects associated with the MRI, researchers use this test to see if and how experience affects brain structure. A functional magnetic resonance image, fMRI, allows researchers to see what is happening in the brain while it is working and tells us about the brain activity associated with the mental experience. Cognitive neuroscience has greatly benefited from the progress of the fMRI. Researchers compare images of the at-rest picture to the activity picture. This comparison yields correlational data. The fMRI can be used to assess functional connectivity, which is the correlation between different brain areas or the degree to which their operation is dependent upon each other. Transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, allows for causal inferences between brain activity and behavior. Scientists induce brief electrical pulses in the brain, which trigger action potentials followed by an immediate deactivation of action potential, causing a virtual lesion. If a particular area of the brain is associated with a behavior, then the temporary disruption of processing in that area should disrupt the behavior as well. The nervous system starts out as a long, hollow tube, and then 3 weeks after conception, cells making up the tube start to differentiate into neurons. These neurons begin to develop into 3 major parts of the brain: the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain. The hindbrain is the lowest portion of the brain. It connects the spinal cord with the rest of the brain and consists of 3 structures. The medulla helps control breathing and regulates reflexes. The cerebellum plays an important role in motor coordination, and the pons is involved in sleep or arousal. The brainstem houses the medulla, pons, and much of the hindbrain, and gets its name largely due to its natural stem-like shape. The brainstem regulates survival-type functions such as breathing, heartbeat, and blood pressure. Contralateral organization, that is where sensory information comes in from one side of the body over the hindbrain level and projects to the opposite side of the body. Ongoing motor messages cross over the hindbrain and control movement and other motor functions on the other side of the brain. The midbrain is located between the hindbrain and the forebrain. The midbrain communicates information between the brain and the eyes and ears. The substantia nigra is considered a subcortical component of the basal ganglia. It is located just above the pons. It is a large and neural pathway in the midbrain. It's involved in motor control and contains a large number of dopamine-producing neurons. Parkinson's disease damages this structure, resulting in movement difficulties. It prepares the other brain regions to initiate organized actions or movements. The reticular formation is by many experts considered an antiquated, obsolete classification, though it's still required content for students studying physiological psychology. The reticular formation passes through the length of the center of the brainstem and ends in the midbrain. The reticular formation is involved in walking, sleeping, or turning to attend to noise. The forebrain is the largest, most complex brain region, which contains centers for complex behaviors and mental processes, also called the cerebrum. The forebrain has increased in size and complexity during evolution. It's the highest level of the brain. The human's forebrain has the most important structures of the limbic system, thalamus, basal ganglia, hypothalamus, and cerebral cortex. The limbic system is part of the forebrain. The limbic system is important to memory and emotion, and it contains the amygdala, which is a kind of like awareness center. It fires selectively at the sight of appropriate foods, mates, and social rivals. The amygdala is also involved in emotional awareness and expression. The hippocampus is involved in the formation and storage of memories. People who have hippocampus damage cannot retain any new memories after the damage occurs. It also contains the thalamus, which is a relay station for much of the sensory information. The basal ganglia also is contained here, that works with the cerebellum and the cerebral cortex in coordinating voluntary movements. The hypothalamus monitors eating, drinking, sexual behavior, emotion, stress, and reward, and it helps to direct the endocrine system. In chimpanzees' brains and the human brain, The hindbrain and the midbrain structures are covered by a forebrain structure called the cerebral cortex. The human hindbrain and midbrain are similar to those of other animals, so it's the relative size of the forebrain that mainly differentiates the human brain from the brains of animals such as rats, cats, and chimps. And in the human brain, as stated before, the structures that are the most important are the limbic system, thalamus, basal ganglia, hypothalamus, and the cerebral cortex. So in what way do you think each of the brains are suited for the challenges that are faced by each particular species? Are the structures similar across all species? Why do you think they may be different? How might life be different for a different species if they had a human brain? The cerebral cortex, it controls some of the highest mental functionings such as thinking and planning. The outermost part of the cerebral cortex is known as the neocortex, and it makes up 80% of the cortex. There are 4 lobes. The lobes are divided into 2 hemispheres, and each hemisphere is divided into 4 lobes. The frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe involves visual stimuli. The temporal lobe involves hearing, language, processing, and memory. The frontal lobe is involved in the control of voluntary muscles, intelligence, and personality. In your book, you'll see a story on Phineas Gage, who was a railroad worker who during an accident had an iron rod go through his face up into his brain. The iron rod went through his frontal lobe. After the accident, Phineas's personality changed dramatically. He was obstinate, moody, irresponsible, selfish, and incapable of taking part in planned activities. This was completely opposite of how he had been prior to the accident. The prefrontal cortex is a part of the frontal lobe. It is at the front of the motor cortex and is involved in higher cognitive functions such as planning, reasoning, and self-control. The parietal lobe involves registering spatial location, attention, and motor control. The somatosensory cortex processes information about body sensations and is located in front of the parietal lobes. The motor cortex processes information about voluntary movements. The somatosensory and motor areas are associated with different parts of the body. Wilder Penfield conducted research on the somatosensory and motor areas and found that when he stimulated a part of one area, a certain part of the body would move. The amount of cortex allotted to a body part is not proportionate to the body part size, but rather to the sensitivity or motor capability of the body part. The association cortex, or association area, processes information about sensory information and motor output. There are association areas throughout the brain, and each sensory system has its own association area in the cerebral cortex. The association cortex is involved in thinking and problem solving. The corpus callosum is a bundle of axons that connect the left and right hemispheres of the brain. When it's severed, the 2 hemispheres cannot communicate with each other. Research has shown that cutting the corpus callosum seems to leave the patient with 2 separate minds that learn and operate independently. Roger Sperry in 1974 conducted an experiment where he would teach a cat who had had its corpus callosum severed to solve a series of visual problems with a blindfold over its right eye so it could only see with its left eye. After the cat learned the task, he would put the blindfold on the opposite eye, the left one, and the cat acted as if it had never learned the task. The memory was stored in one hemisphere that could no longer communicate with the other. It turns out that the right hemisphere receives information only for the left side of the body, and the left hemisphere receives information only for the right side of the body. The left hemisphere is largely involved with language processing and production. When we are reading, the left hemisphere recognizes words and numbers and comprehends syntax and grammar. Expressive aphasia, also called Broca's aphasia, is a language disorder that involves the inability to produce language and is related to brain injury. Damage to Broca's area is located in the left hemisphere will cause a person to have difficulty speaking or speech production. Damage to the Wernicke area, which is located in the left hemisphere, will cause a person to have difficulty understanding spoken language or language comprehension. The right hemisphere function. The right hemisphere is not as verbally oriented as the left, but it does play a role in word recognition. Recently, the right hemisphere was found to be involved in conversational processing. However, the real strength is the ability to process nonverbal information, spatial perception, visual recognition, and emotion. There is also a part in the brain on the right side called the fusiform face area, which is located in the right temporal lobe, and it is specialized to recognize faces. Right-brained versus left brain. These categories exist because we know that the brain's two hemispheres have various functions, but there's no scientific basis for these categories. Humans have two hemispheres for a reason, and we use them both. There's a considerable integration of function between different areas in the brain. When information or stimuli is noticed, the information gets sent to the correct area of the brain where it's processed, and then sent out of the brain to the correct area of the body. Along the way, from the beginning to the end, the information goes through various areas of the brain, and all these areas work together to get the information processed. Moving on to the endocrine system. It consists of glands that regulate certain organs by releasing their chemical products into the bloodstream. Glands are the organs or tissues in the body that produce chemical messengers known as hormones. The pituitary gland involves growth and regulates other glands. The adrenal glands are involved in regulating mood, energy, and the ability to cope with stress. The adrenal glands secrete both epinephrine and norepinephrine. The pancreas is a gland which serves dual purposes, digestive and endocrine functions. The pancreas is responsible for secreting insulin, which helps regulate the metabolism of the body and weight. The ovaries and testes are endocrine glands responsible for producing hormones related to sexual development and reproduction. The endocrine system and nervous system are interconnected. However, the endocrine system functions with much differently than the nervous system, in that it is much slower and not all of the glands are connected to each other as intricately as the parts in the nervous system are. Research has been conducted on patients with brain damage to determine how the brain can repair itself. Recovery from brain damage depends on the age of the individual and the extent of the brain injury or damage. Most of the human's brain plasticity is found in young children before the age of 5. For example, if a child before the age of 5 has brain damage to the left hemisphere, then the right hemisphere will pick up much of the language function. However, if the damage occurs after the age of 5, there may be permanent language disability. Much of the brain's ability to repair itself depends on whether the neurons in the damaged area are completely destroyed. If the neurons were not destroyed, brain function may be restored over time. Collateral sprouting is one way in which the brain can repair itself. The axons on the adjacent neurons grow more branches. Substitution of function is the second way the brain can repair itself. Another area of the brain takes over the functions of the damaged area. Neurogenesis is the process where new neurons are generated. In humans, neurogenesis has only been documented in the hippocampus and the olfactory bulb. Brain tissue grafts or implants of healthy tissue are placed into the damaged brain. The most successful cases of brain grafts result in the tissue for the implants coming from the fetal stage, since tissue at this stage is more likely to make connections with other neurons than mature brain tissue. The use of human embryonic stem cells has been a hot debate in recent years. Stem cells are unique because they have the ability to develop into most types of cells. Typically, the researchers have harvested stem cells from frozen embryos left over from in vitro fertilization procedures. These embryos are in the blastocyst stage, which occurs 5 days after fertilization. So looking at genetics and behavior, the nucleus of each cell contains 46 chromosomes, which are essentially 23 pairs, with 1 pair coming from each parent. Chromosomes contain deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA, which is the molecule that carries a person's genetic information. Genes are the segments of chromosomes that are composed of DNA, and they have the hereditary information. Genes hold the code for creating proteins out of amino acids. The Human Genome Project is dedicated to documenting the human genome. an organism's complete genetic material. The study of genetics has led to several discoveries. Gregor Mendel first started research on genetics in the mid-19th century when he studied the heredity of pea plants. He discovered through crossbreeding plants with different characteristics predictable patterns of heredity, and thereby laid the foundation for modern genetics. According to the dominant recessive genes principle, if one gene of a pair is dominant over the other, the dominant gene resides over the recessive one. The recessive gene only exerts its influence if both genes of a pair are recessive. The relationship between genes and characteristics is complex. Polygenic inheritance refers to the influence of multiple genes on behavior. Molecular genetics involves the manipulation of genes through technology to determine their effect on behavior. Selective breeding occurs when organisms are chosen for reproduction based on how much of a particular trait they display. It is unethical to conduct selective breeding studies with human beings. The genome-wide association method within the Human Genome Project has led to the use of genome-wide association to identify genetic variations linked to a particular disease. Gene linkage studies are now being conducted on a wide variety of disorders and health. Linkage analyses are used to help identify the location of certain genes by referring to other genes whose position is already known. Replication is a key challenge in both types of research studies. Behavior genetics is the study of the degree and nature of hereditary's influence on behavior. In twin studies, behavior genetics studies the extent to which individuals are shaped by the hereditary or their environmental influence. Fraternal twins, not identical, develop from a separate egg and sperm, while identical twins develop from a single fertilized egg that split into two. The behavioral similarity of identical twins is compared to the behavioral similarity of fraternal twins. One study found that identical twins were more similar than fraternal twins on measures of self-esteem, life satisfaction, and optimism for the future. It seemed that the genetic tendency to have a positive attitude toward different aspects of life was there, but in contrast, the environment explained how a person might have a high self-esteem but lower life satisfaction. There are some issues with twin studies because a lot of times, if you're looking at twin studies of identical twins who were reared in separate locations, sometimes the twins were together for several months before split up, or may have been reunited prior to the study. And also adoptions agencies have a tendency to put identical twins in similar type homes. And ultimately, even strangers are likely to have some coincidental similarities. Genotype is a person's genetic heritage. A phenotype is a person's observable characteristics. It refers to both the physical and psychological characteristics of a person. Whether a gene is turned on or not depends on the collaboration between heredity and environmental factors. Genetic expression is a term that refers to the gene's activity that affects the body's cells and is influenced by the gene's environment. The author discussed earlier in the book about different characteristics based on prefrontal lobe asymmetry, and that positive emotional responses were found to be more associated with left prefrontal lobe activity and negative emotional responses with more the right prefrontal lobe activity. Biofeedback can be used to train oneself to lower blood pressure, pulse rate, etc. There are different methods, but one is to put a pulsometer on one's finger and have a machine that beeps quickly as the pulse increases and slows down in frequency as the pulse lowers. It allows a person to use different types of techniques such as deep breathing, imagery, relaxation, and they learn what it takes to be able to lower their pulse rate, and they can regulate their own responses. Mindfulness is another way to help people reduce their stress responses. One attempt focuses on what they're feeling or sensing in their bodies, to pay attention to what's going on in their bodies and help them to get their mind off of stressful problems or events and focus on taking care of their body. Rumination is used when people make themselves miserable. It involves prolonged self-focused negative thinking and can involve replaying the same problem or personal mistake over and over. One study conducted by Bratman in 2015 took participants and looked at and assessed their level of rumination. They had two different groups that were instructed to take a 90-minute walk. One group took a walk in an urban setting, and the second group in a natural environment. Participants then rated their level of rumination before and after the walk. Also, an fMRI was used to measure brain activation in the subgenual prefrontal cortex. This is an area that's active when there's negative emotional states such as sadness or stress. The results showed a decrease in rumination and activity in the subgenual prefrontal cortex in those who took a walk in the natural environment. But there was no difference for the group who took a walk in an urban setting. So what we took away from this is that being out in nature can help reduce stress. Why do you think it is that exposure to a walk in an urban setting did not have the same effect? So stress is the response of individuals to stressors. They're circumstances or events that threaten your well-being. When a person experiences stress, physiological changes take place, such as your heart racing, sweating. When a person's exposed to a threat, the sympathetic nervous system kicks into gear. Acute stress is the stress that occurs in response to immediate perceived threat. Acute stress is adaptive because it helps us to survive threats and to survive. Chronic stress is a stress that occurs continuously and may lead to persistent autonomic nervous system arousal. With chronic stress, the parasympathetic nervous system does not get a chance to maintain and repair. In addition, there is an unusually high level of hormones circulating in the body, which can cause a breakdown in the immune system. So basically, with the chronic stress, the amygdala is activated and your fight or flight response is on at all times, which, as you can imagine, is going to wear and tear on your system. Cognitive psychologists believe that one of the ways to combat stress is by changing the interpretation of the experience from something seen as negative to something seen as a positive opportunity. So if you think about people with the glass is half full mentality versus the glass is half empty mentality, it also ties into the research on Facebook are the ones who have and the ones who have not, depending on how you view things. So this chapter in review is hopefully you can describe the parts and functions of the nervous system, explain what neurons are and how they process information, identify the brain's level structures and functions, state what the endocrine system is and how it affects behavior, describe the brain's capacity for recovery and repair, explain how genetics increases our understanding of behavior, and describe the role of the biological foundations of human psychology and the body's stress response.